I saw a lot of headlines on the way here about how it was going to cost $600,000 in security for this event. And that is not due to me. I mean, I'm not the one out threatening to break windows. It's not due to you. You're here listening. It's due to the Antifa hard-left morons who are out there breaking windows. And I do want to say one thing, which is that in a city as left as Berkeley, if you're going to blame me for the $600,000 in spending on security, you're all Keynesians. Think of all the jobs I just created. Now, this lecture is titled Say No to Campus Thuggery. That's the title of the lecture because of Antifa and the wave of violence that has engulfed this campus since earlier this year. They say on this that the problem is not campus thuggery. For those of you who can't see, it says, no, Ben Shapiro, the problem is not campus thuggery. The problem is fascist intellectual thuggery in the service of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. Well, to believe this, you have to have your head so far up your ass you can actually see your colon firsthand. Let's define a few terms. First of all, fascist intellectual thuggery. Let's start with fascism. What exactly is fascism? Well, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot by people who have never read a book. Okay, fascism is the phenomenon whereby people believe that they have the capacity to ram their beliefs down your throat at the point of a gun, or say the point of a baton, or by throwing Molotov cocktails. That's what fascism truly is. Fascism is even more of a tactic than it is an ideology. It's sort of vague in terms of ideology. You've had people on the left who are fascist, people like Stalin, and then you've had people who are on the European right, like Hitler, who is a fascist, who's actually closer to the traditional American left than he would be to the traditional American right. But I've been spending my entire career standing up against fascism and the idea of an overreaching government that uses the power of the gun in order to compel people to do what they want. Antifa is fascist. I am not a fascist. The reason that I am here is because fascism does not own this university. Because there are students who do want to hear differing views, who don't want to be told that they can only hear one view, who don't believe that the First Amendment should die under the jackboots and Birkenstocks of a bunch of anarchist communist pieces of garbage. I assume you can handle disagreement. If, in fact, you cannot handle disagreement, you are making your life harder, and you're making your life worse, and you are making the country worse. You're driving political polarization by failing to engage on a level of discussion. As you know, well, we're going to do a Q&A after this, and I love taking questions. It's my favorite thing, and I have a rule, which is if you disagree with me, you raise your hand and you go to the front of the line, because discussion makes the country better. But you feeling insulted and then whining about it, and then suggesting that you're a victim without evidence and that I have victimized you because I won't accept your victimhood, this makes the country a worse place. Okay, here are the 3 rules that you need to fulfill as a person before you can start complaining about your life failures being the result of somebody else's actions. Number 1, you need to finish high school. Number 2, you need to get married before you have babies. Number 3, you need to get a job. That's it. You do those things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States of America. According to the Brookings Institute, 2% of Americans who follow these rules are in poverty. 75% have joined the middle class. Well, what about racism? 71% of poor families with children are unmarried. The poverty rate among non-married white families was 22% in 2008. That same year, the poverty rate among black married couples was less than 7%. But what happened to racism? Why weren't those black married couples poorer than the single white moms? Because it doesn't have to do with color. It has to do with life decisions. And we can talk about differentials in crime and where these statistics come from. I mean, the basic rule is that if you don't commit crime, you're not going to be arrested for it. The police are not going around arresting black people for the fun of it. They're going around arresting criminals based on criminal reports, which is why the number of criminal reports based on race matches up exactly with the number of criminal arrests based on race. Okay, if you don't report people for crime, it's hard for the police to know to pick them up. Okay, how about women? This idea that women are vastly victimized in our society. Hillary Clinton is making buco dollars off of this nonsense this week. As I tweeted earlier this week we found out that a clown can emerge from the woods and scare half of Americans, and also it came out. But Hillary Clinton is going around whining about how there's a glass ceiling and she couldn't break through it and it's all because of sexism. It's not because she was the world's worst candidate and a pretty appalling human being. No, it was because everybody is a sexist. Everybody's a sexist. And we hear in this context very much about the wage gap, right? The idea that women are paid significantly less than men, 72 cents on the dollar. Okay, that's absolute sheer nonsense. It is absolute nonsense. In 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in America, women make 8% more money than men do in their peer group. That wage gap is growing, not shrinking. At colleges, 55% of women in college are women. That gap is getting larger. 58% of all graduate degrees go to women. Okay, the majority of voters are women. If we are living in a place where women are vastly victimized by men, I'd really like to see that place. But there's another group that engages in identity politics that I want to talk about now. And it's the battle between the identity politics of the left and the identity politics of the so-called alt-right that is really making the country a significantly worse place, and it needs to stop now because it is utter and complete horrible bullshit. The first thing to note, this notion that the alt-right is actually conservative is nonsense. Let me define what I mean by alt-right, because not everybody who likes Pepe memes or Harambe memes is a member of the alt-right. Okay, not everybody that the left says is alt-right is actually alt-right. I mean, the left calls me alt-right, which is patently insane. I mean, you legitimately have to have a screw loose to call me alt-right. I spend half my career attacking the alt-right. Okay, what is the alt-right? So the alt-right are a group of people who believe that ideology and ethnicity are inextricably intertwined, just like the identity politics left, right? On the identity politics left, if you're a black person who is a leftist, you're a leftist because you're a black person. On the identity politics right, Western civilization was not built by people with good ideas, it was built by people with white skin. And that means that people who don't have white skin cannot properly assimilate into Western civilization. This has no grounding in reality. The fact is that there were lots of white people in Britain before the Romans arrived, and they weren't living a civilized life, as we would currently call it, under Western civilization. Okay, in fact, the people who, the Romans, right, when Italians were coming to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, there was tremendous discrimination against Italians because they weren't considered properly white. The definition of white moves around a lot based on convenience. Right? Sometimes Jews are white, sometimes Jews are not white. It sort of depends on what you're talking about. But according to the alt-right, because ideology and race are inextricably intertwined, they must have a white identity politics all their own. If there's a group of people who are fighting for the group identity politics of blacks or of women or of gays and lesbians, then there has to be a white group that fights back on behalf of the white race. As you may have noticed, I think all of this is disgusting. Okay, Western civilization is not built on race. There have been lots of countries all over Europe that were not particularly civilized and were quite white. Okay, freedom, personal responsibility, separation of powers, God-given rights protected by a government elected with the consent of the government. These are the values of Western civilization. But the alt-right actually overtly rejects these ideas. They say the Constitution is outmoded. So, how do we solve all this, right? We're on campus and we're hearing the identity politics of the left, and then you watch the news and you see the identity politics of the alt-right. How do you solve all of this? Well, the way that you solve all of this, first of all, let's start with the campus thuggery. The way you solve all that is by letting the police do their jobs. Okay? Administrators need to let the police do their jobs. None of this would have gone anywhere if back in February, when Milo, who I significantly dislike, when Milo came to speak, if they had allowed the police to do their jobs and arrest everyone who even hinted at violence. Okay, people who get violent should be arrested and they should spend time in jail. And the authorities have a responsibility to allow the police to do their jobs. And this is not the fault of the cops. This is the fault of cowardly political actors who, pusillanimous cowards, who hide behind their desks every time some people on the left whine a little bit. Okay, the second thing that has to happen is you have to stop seeing everybody in America as an enemy who despises you based on identity. Again, they don't care about you. You're not that important a human. Okay, not that many of us know each other. Not that many of us care about each other. We care about our families. We care about our friends. And we certainly don't want to stop each other. We mostly want to be treated civilly. And we can all do that if we stop looking into each other's eyes and seeing a potential enemy instead of seeing somebody who's just a person who probably doesn't care about you very much and doesn't want to stop you and doesn't mind what you do. This is not difficult stuff. And finally, stop seeing yourself as a victim, because in order to see everybody else as an enemy, which justifies your violence and hate against them, you have to see yourself as their victim. Again, America is the greatest country in human history. You are not a victim. If you are a victim of something, you need to show me what you are a victim of, and I will stand beside you. But do not blame the freest, most civil society in the history of planet Earth for your failures, because that's on you. I do think that America can see a better day, because I think we're in a dark moment right now. But I think we can get to a brighter moment if we stop seeing each other as members of groups and identifying as members of groups primarily, and instead see each other as individuals made in God's image, one with equal value to another in God's eyes. If we do that, America will see a resurgence. All right. Now the fun part. So, we're going to do Q&A.
And I just wanted to know, why exactly do you think a first trimester fetus has moral value?
Okay, so a first trimester fetus has moral value because whether you consider it a potential human life or a full-on human life, it has more value than just a cluster of cells. If left to its natural processes, it will grow into a baby. So the real question is, where do you draw the line? So you're going to draw the line at the heartbeat, because it's very hard to draw the line at the heartbeat. There are people who are adults who are alive because of a pacemaker. They need some sort of outside force generating their heartbeat. Okay, are you going to do it based on brain function? Okay, well, what about people who are in a coma? Should we just kill them? Right? The problem is, anytime you draw any line other than the inception of the child, you end up drawing a false line that can also be applied to people who are adults. So either human life has intrinsic value or it doesn't. I think we both agree that adult human life has intrinsic value. Can we start from that premise?
I believe that sentience is what gives something moral value, not necessarily being a human alone.
Okay,
because,
when you're asleep, can I stab you?
I'm still considered sentient when I'm asleep.
Okay, if you are in a coma from which you may awake, can I stab you?
Well then, no, I guess not. I mean, like,
I'm glad you answered that, because I have no interest in actually murdering you.
But that's still potential sentience, and it's still a potential. Like,
I agree.
Like,
it is potential sentience. You know what else is potential sentience? Being a fetus.
The issue with that. The issue I have with that, though, is that if I'm in a coma and I'm not like doing anything to anyone, I'm not causing any issues amongst the world. Whereas an unwanted child may or may not be a burden to people.
Okay, well, there are lots of people who are unwanted, right? I mean, there are lots of people's parents who are unwanted, right? We're a bunch of college students. You know, the problem is that now you're shifting the argument, right? Before you were making the argument based on the intrinsic value of a life based on sentience, and now you're talking about the level of burden that somebody presents as a separate moral argument. Okay, I don't believe that you being a burden on somebody is justification for them killing you, as a general rule.
I'll leave it at that.
Hey Ben, this is a two-parter, PSA and question. So PSA is that even though there was a bunch of standby tickets and there was a line out the door, the administration revoked all the standby tickets for all those people, and I think that that should be openly shunned. That's totally bad.
Yeah, I did hear that, and that's egregious. I mean, obviously, look at this. I mean, we've got empty seats here, and the only reason we had more than 3,000 people signed up for this event. The administration cut off the upper balcony because they were apparently afraid that Antifa was going to somehow rip out the bolted down seats and fling them onto the people below. I'm not joking. Like, this was the actual excuse that they gave. And then we thought, okay, there were going to be a bunch of people who signed up on the left to get tickets and didn't show up, specifically so there would be empty seats. And as you say, hundreds of people showed up outside and were not allowed in because the administration seized the tickets. If it's for safety reasons...
It's cowardice.
Okay, you know, I'll try to assume the best, that it's for safety reasons, but if it's cowardice, obviously it's cowardice and should be openly condemned.
What would you say to a person like me who is open to discourse and people of all sides? How would you combat, or at least how would you approach people who come with me with hate and saying like, no, you're a bad person because you're hanging out with these people?
Well,
how
again,
should I approach them?
So I have a basic rule on this, and it's the same, again, regardless of color, because I've said this to people of every color. If somebody calls you a racist or a bigot, based on no evidence, this makes them a bad person, and you have every right to say so. They need to actually cite evidence for why you're a racist or a bigot or a bad person before they can call you that. It needs to actually be justified, and you have every rationale to walk away from that conversation thinking that person is a worse person if they can't explain to you what you've done wrong and why what you've done is so terrible.
Okay, that works for me.
And thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
The gender pay gap is a myth.
Yes.
And one of the main reasons that this is the case is because that female STEM education is at a lower level than it is for men. Females are continually discouraged to not go into STEM fields at a rate that's like much lower than men are. So I was wondering what you feel about this argument, and like, you know, how do you like think it should be remedied, or like nothing should be done?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a free country. You can choose what profession to go into. If the idea is that the pay gap is largely due to profession choice, that's obviously true. If you look at a lot of dangerous professions, firemen, people who work on oil rigs, it tends to be men because men want to go into those professions. It's also true that men tend to spend more hours in the workplace. It's also true that women tend to take more time off with babies. That's not a bad thing, by the way. It's not a rip on women. It's always bewildering to me when feminists are like, it's terrible that women take time off to be with their babies. Why? I think it's a wonderful thing. It's certainly true that when you look at, for example, what women major in college, the number of women who major in STEM studies, which has nothing to do with getting a job and paying, women major in humanities much more than men do. Men are just interested in this stuff more. That's not a terrible thing. I don't see why that.
Yeah, but I mean, like, there's
thing.
Societal influence that occurs even before the college level, right? I mean,
I don't know that there are a lot of people saying to a 7th grade girl who's good at math, you need to stop that and go read some poetry. I mean, listen, What I don't want is lowering of standards in science to meet any particular person, and I also don't want this idea that because a woman chooses not to go into science, and a lot of women choose not to go into science, and that creates a disproportionate percentage based on individual choice, that suddenly this is some sort of group discrimination happening in front of us.
My left-leaning friends, they say, that's an inevitable trend. You know, this inevitable trend towards liberalism is just, it's something you cannot control. It's the way society is headed. And my question is, do you think it's an inevitable trend? And if not, how can we combat it as conservative students, you know, braving this, you know, horrendous climate with both, you know, our peers calling us fascists and Nazis and the administration just being extremely terrible as well?
So listen, I don't think it's an inevitable trend. I think that things move in cycles, and I think that there's two ways that the country can break out of it. One is that things can just continue to slide downward to the point where people get wise after a long time, or we can have events like this one that I think are actually really useful in showing the liberals that they are not the left, okay? I do make a distinction. You notice I always use the language left to describe the left, not liberals. There's a reason. Liberals are people who believe in open discourse and believe in discussion, even if they disagree with me on the role of government in the economy, for example. Leftists are people who believe that I need to be shut down because my speech is insulting their identity and is a form of violence. If the liberals in the country can stand up to the left and say to them, enough is enough, then I think that there's hope for a discourse, and I do believe in the innate rationality of the American people and the capacity that they have for coming to the correct conclusions. I do think that there's a possibility, I mean, that's why I'm in the business I'm in. It's why I spend my life trying to change people's minds. I think there are people who are willing to listen to facts and arguments. If I didn't think that, then I'd just go be a lawyer. So the fact is that I don't think any of this is inevitable. I think that's a little bit of self-congratulatory claptrap from your liberal friend. Oh, well, you know, of course society is shifting towards us. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then why did Republicans just take the House, the Senate, all the state houses, all the governorships, and the presidency? Like, come on. But when you talk about the Overton window, I don't think that it exists just in terms of politics, left versus right. I think it also exists in terms of the nature of the discourse itself. And there I think that we have moved in a really negative direction. I think we've moved away from discussion and toward clubbing each other. And I think that has to be stopped in its tracks. And that's why I thank everybody here for coming and being part of a free speech event that, let's be frank, it was cordial, it was nice. I really enjoyed hanging out with all of you. And I think that we need more of this, because if we don't have more of this, instead we're going to get more of what you were almost going to see outside if it hadn't been for the force of the police officers.